What happened to the Confederate Navy after 1865? When people think about the Civil War, they usually picture battles like Gettysburg or Antietam. But the Confederacy also had a navy. It was small and often outmatched, but it played an important role. Confederate ships raided Union commerce, protected southern ports, and experimented with new technology. The ironclad CSS Virginia, the submarine H.L. Hunley, and a handful of fast blockade runners became part of Civil War legend. But when the Confederacy collapsed in 1865, its navy disappeared almost instantly. Sailors scattered. Ships were burned or seized. Foreign crews were stranded. Officers who had spent years at sea had to figure out how to rebuild their lives in a country that had lost the war. This video looks at what became of the Confederate Navy after 1865 and how its sailors adapted when their service ended overnight. Total collapse in a single week. In the final months of the war, the Confederate Navy was already falling apart. Fuel was scarce, shipyards were damaged, ports were blockaded, the government could barely pay salaries. By early April 1865, when Richmond fell, the Navy had no hope of continuing. Confederate Secretary of the Navy Stephen Mallory ordered many of the remaining ships to be destroyed. Crews scuttled ironclads, burned gunboats, and sank whatever they could not save. The goal was simple. They wanted to prevent their vessels from falling into Union hands. In a matter of days, a navy that had taken 4 years to build was gone. Sailors returning home. Most Confederate sailors were not wealthy planters. They were working-class men from coastal towns. Many had been fishermen, dockworkers, or merchant sailors before the war. When the conflict ended, they faced the same problems as Confederate soldiers on land. Many returned to ruined towns along the Gulf and Atlantic coasts. Ports like Mobile, Savannah, Charleston, New Orleans, and Wilmington had suffered years of bombardment and blockade. Businesses were closed, ships were gone. Jobs were scarce. Some sailors went back to fishing and coastal trade. Others found work in shipyards as the South rebuilt its ports. A few moved north or west, where industrial jobs were more plentiful. Former Union sailors had an easier time returning to their profession. The United States Navy expanded after the war, and the northern merchant fleet recovered quickly. Former Confederate sailors had no such support. Their government no longer existed, and their ships were gone. Officers facing an uncertain future. Confederate naval officers had a different set of problems. Many had resigned from the United States Navy in 1861 to join the Confederacy. When the war ended, they had no country to serve, no pensions, and no guarantee that the United States would take them back. Some officers applied for presidential pardons. Others avoided politics and tried to rebuild careers quietly. Many became mercenaries or advisors. A number of former Confederate officers went abroad. Their skills were still valuable, and foreign governments were willing to hire experienced naval commanders. Some went to Egypt, which was modernizing its navy. Others went to Brazil or Chile. They trained foreign crews, built ships, and helped organize new fleets. These officers became soldiers of fortune in the global naval world of the late 1800s. A few returned to the United States Navy. Only a small number returned to US service. The United States Navy was cautious about allowing former Confederates back into command positions. Still, a handful did rejoin in junior roles and lived out quiet careers. Most, however, spent the rest of their lives in civilian jobs. They became engineers, port inspectors, or businessmen, blockade runners and smugglers. One of the most interesting parts of the Confederate Navy was the group of blockade runners. These were fast, low-profile ships that slipped past the Union blockade to bring in goods from Bermuda, the Bahamas, and Europe. Their captains were daring and often reckless. Many of them became rich during the war. After 1865, their world disappeared completely. There was no blockade to run and no wartime profit to chase. Some blockade runners became merchant captains in peacetime. Their knowledge of international trade made them valuable. Others continued smuggling. The skills they had learned during the war carried over naturally into illegal trade. A few became involved in Caribbean gunrunning or coastal contraband operations. Many moved to Britain or the Caribbean to avoid financial ruin in the post-war South. The fate of Confederate ironclads. The Confederacy had built several ironclad ships during the war. These armored vessels were expensive and difficult to maintain. When the Confederacy collapsed, most were destroyed to prevent capture. The CSS Virginia had already been lost early in the war, after its famous battle with the USS Monitor. The CSS Albemarle was sunk in 1864. The CSS Tennessee was captured. Other ironclads were burned or scuttled. By the time the war ended, there were almost no functioning Confederate ironclads left. They remained sat in rivers and harbors for years. Salvage crews dismantled many of them. Pieces were melted down or reused in local industry. Some wrecks remain today as archaeological sites. Confederate sailors who had served on ironclads returned to ordinary life. Their specialized experience meant little after the war. Most had to relearn civilian trades. Foreign-built ships, the CSS Shenandoah. One of the most dramatic stories of the Confederate Navy happened after the war ended. The CSS Shenandoah was a commerce raider built in Britain and manned by an international crew. It roamed the oceans attacking Union merchant ships. The Shenandoah did not receive news of the Confederacy's surrender until months later. In June 1865, long after the war was over, it captured several American whaling ships in the Pacific. When the crew finally learned that the Confederacy no longer existed, they sailed to Liverpool and surrendered to British authorities in November. This was the last Confederate surrender of the entire war. The crew then scattered across the world. Some returned to the United States. Others stayed abroad to avoid being prosecuted for piracy. A few joined foreign navies. The story of the Shenandoah's surrender became part of maritime law, life along the coast after the war. Communities along the southern coast had relied heavily on shipping and trade before the war. The blockade and years of fighting had destroyed their economies. After 1865, these communities faced a long, slow rebuilding process. Former Confederate sailors played a role in that rebuilding. They helped repair piers and shipyards. They worked as pilots on rivers and coastal channels. Some became fishermen or oyster harvesters. The maritime culture of the South survived, but it looked very different from what existed before the war. Plantations were broken apart. Slave labor was gone. Wealth had evaporated. Coastal industries had to reinvent themselves. The Confederate Marine Corps. The Confederate Marine Corps was small but active. After the war, its members faced the same challenges as Confederate soldiers and sailors. Most returned to civilian life quickly. They took up farming, trade, or small business. A few former Marines moved west. Others entered law enforcement. They rarely talked publicly about their service, and their stories faded into local memory. The Confederate Marine Corps did not leave behind a major legacy, but its veterans quietly blended into Southern society in the decades after the war. The impact of Reconstruction. Reconstruction shaped the lives of former naval personnel, just as it shaped the lives of former soldiers. Many former sailors lived in states that faced federal occupation for years. They saw new laws, new political systems, and new forms of labor. Some accepted Reconstruction, others resisted. A few joined paramilitary groups that opposed federal policies. But unlike former Confederate soldiers, sailors were often removed from local plantation politics. Many lived in port cities that depended on trade rather than agriculture. Their communities adapted to the new economy more quickly than inland regions. Veterans groups and memory. Confederate naval veterans eventually formed their own organizations. These groups were smaller than the Confederate Army associations, but they held meetings, published memoirs, and tried to preserve the Navy's history. Some former naval officers wrote books defending their service. Others wrote technical accounts of naval engineering or blockade running. Their stories influenced the lost cause narrative, often presenting the Confederate Navy as skillful, heroic, and innovative. Monuments and memorials dedicated to naval officers and ships appeared in several southern towns during the late 1800s and early 1900s. A quiet ending for most sailors. Most Confederate sailors did not become famous after the war. They lived quiet lives as laborers, fishermen, clerks, or small business owners. Their wartime experiences became memories that they shared with family or fellow veterans. They were part of a navy that disappeared almost as quickly as it had been created. Their skills helped rebuild southern ports, but their service did not earn pensions or public honors. Their stories often remained in letters, journals, and local oral histories. The Confederate Navy ceased to exist almost instantly after the war. Its ships were destroyed, its officers scattered, its sailors returned to homes that had changed forever. Some went abroad, some built new careers along the coast. A few capitalized on their wartime fame, while most faded quietly into ordinary life. Their experiences remind us that even the most dramatic moments in history are followed by long periods of adjustment. Once the Confederacy fell, these men had to reinvent themselves in a country that no longer recognized the uniform they had worn. Thank you for watching. If you want more videos like this, tell us in the comments. We will see you in the next one.